Well, as for us, we're going to continue a study I began 2 weeks ago about New Testament soul winners. I planned this to coincide with the monthly studies that Glenn is doing. Thankful for him leading those conversations. And I thought we'd continue the conversations on Wednesday evenings here. And we'd take a look at these New Testament examples of soul winners. We considered the first of a kind, the first of a New Testament kind last time, 2 weeks ago, when we talked about the prophet John and how it was that John proved effective in bringing that message that he was appointed to bring, and how rapidly it increased in the number of those who would follow Jesus. So again, we're going to the Gospel of John, chapter 1. Back into that same context from last time, but just a little further this time, to talk about Andrew. We did note last time, there was Andrew, and then Andrew found Peter, and both of them together found somebody else, and the number of followers was rapidly increasing. But we're going to consider particularly Andrew. He's not mentioned very often in the New Testament. I think only about a total of 7 times. But every time he's mentioned, he's always doing the same thing. He's bringing someone to Jesus, introducing someone to Jesus, or the result of his work with someone else is causing more people to come to Jesus. Of course, while his brother is much better known, we might not know of Peter if Andrew hadn't brought him to Jesus. It's interesting that the mentions of Andrew is here. The first mentions in John chapter 1, verse 39 and following. And then there's another first when we get to John chapter 6, verses 8 and 9. There he's introducing a little boy who has 5 loaves and 2 fishes to Jesus. And look at the result of that. We don't know how many people as a result of that would follow Jesus. And then if you go all the way to John chapter 12, verse 20 and 22, Andrew's not working alone there, but he's introducing more Gentiles to the Lord. And we have to see that as the most important task for our lives. Introducing others to the Savior, making possible their getting acquainted. Why is it, you wonder? Why is it that Andrew is so diligent in introducing others to the Lord? I believe he understands he's been called. He's been appointed for this. As soon as Jesus said to him, "Come and follow me," well, if he's following Jesus, he's going to do what Jesus is doing. In Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 through 20, it's where he was called by Jesus to be fishers of men. In Matthew's account, of course, Matthew's writing more than 30 years after the fact. In hindsight, Matthew gives Peter top billing, as so often happens. The most outspoken one is usually given top billing. And yet in John's account here in the Gospel of John 1 and verse 41, we're reminded how it actually happened. Sometimes it's pictured as, well, the 2 of them were called together, and yes, they were. But how did that come about? John chapter 1, verse 41. He finds first his own brother Simon and says to him, "We have found the Messiah," which is, being interpreted, Christ. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked upon him and said, You are Simon, the son of John. You shall be called Cephas, which is by interpretation Peter. Fairly simple transaction there, isn't it? He's brought him to Jesus. He's done what he was to do, hasn't he? Now, what happens between Jesus and Peter, that's between the two of them. That's largely up to Peter's response. But Andrew's done what he should do. He went to find his brother. And then others of them are finding still more. It is the work really that we're given to do. You know, we're reminded in Luke 19 verse 10 that Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. Well, we too are involved in that, and in the finding and in the calling and in the bringing. Why Andrew? I mean, he's an ordinary guy, having an ordinary job, making a living in ordinary ways. But what's he understand once he's been called to follow Jesus? He has an extraordinary responsibility. That's the extraordinary work of his life, is bringing others to meet Jesus. Of course, in the biblical accounts, Andrew doesn't quite get he doesn't rank with Peter and Paul and with others, but I mean, in this way, we're never told that he preached a sermon. But would we have heard a sermon ever out of Peter if Andrew hadn't brought him to Jesus? And so, Andrew's efforts, he sets before us an example, an excellent example. We're going to consider three aspects of the work that are evident in Andrew's life. We're going to consider his task and his testimony and his triumph, because he was successful in this. What's the soul winner's task? Well, verse 41 tells us, we've already touched on it. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother. And it's interesting that if you look at each word in the phrase, the word first. I mean, after he first himself determined, I'm going to follow Jesus, what's on his mind at the same time? I'm going to get my brother to follow Jesus. Now, of course, that's exactly how it is to be. Doesn't seem like Andrew waited at any time at all, did he? It's like, I just met the Lord. I found the Christ. And I'm going to immediately go and tell someone else. I'm going to find someone else. I wonder if Peter, this is just supposing, do you suppose Peter would have been so quick in coming to meet Jesus also if Andrew had just showed up for work the next day, didn't say a thing about it? Oh, maybe course a few days or something, it might just happen to come up. Oh, by the way, I met this guy named Jesus. What if Andrew had let his excitement cool? And what might have been Peter's response? You know, if it just comes up in conversation like, oh, by the way. I was thinking about this by an experience of our younger son. He goes to that large congregation over in Meridian. And there was a man, I think a few years older than Joseph, but, you know, kind of the same generation. And they had known each other quite a while. Both of them were involved in, I think, in a softball team, and they'd see each other working out at the gym and all that kind of stuff. They had known each other, I think, about a year and a half. And it wasn't until the young man died that he figured out they were both members of the same congregation of the Lord's church. I don't say that to shame my son, but the fact is, for neither one of those two men, bringing others to meet Jesus wasn't their first priority. And I suspect sometimes we've been in that situation, haven't we? No. I mean, they went a year and a half counting each other as friends. And neither of the two, at least to the other one, had said anything about Jesus. What if Andrew had done that with Peter? What kind of response would there be? Would there in the following days been that same multiplication in the number of followers? Well, that's all supposition, but still. That's what we're called to do. And in that word find, he went to find his brother Peter. Now, he likely didn't have to go far, and he likely knew where he would be. But Andrew knew it's necessary because Jesus had come to earth to find him. I suspect Jesus likely urged Andrew to find others. But the real sense of it is that he sensed the urgency to find him. It's in that word find. It's not that they just happened upon it. It's that they discovered that for which their heart had been seeking. When he finds them. Now, the advantage, I guess, that Andrew has in that case is Peter being a Jew, like all the Jews, they had in mind seeking for a Messiah. And it's been their history to expect the coming of a Messiah. And Andrew says, I have found him. In that way, yes, it is true in the sense of that word find. Yes, it made an impression upon them because they have, according to the meaning of that word, they have discovered that for which they had been seeking. Reminds me of the parable about the woman with the 10 coins on her headband, and she loses one, and she goes to find it. She's greatly relieved when she does. Finds that which she was so diligently seeking to find. And so it is just that important, isn't it? That what we have found, we should urge others to find as well. And so it's the necessity, beyond Peter also being a Jew, it's the necessity of realizing that when we meet someone, we're meeting a soul that needs to meet the Lord. We're meeting oftentimes people who are lost. We have to see them as lost. I think it's interesting sometimes when an airplane crash occurs, sometimes someone will say, well, there's X number of souls lost. That's it. It's not just bodies, it's souls. When that really grips us, then we realize what we must do to help others that they might come to Jesus. We know from Acts chapter 4 and verse 12 that there is no other name which has been given under heaven by which men must be saved. That's that urgency. You got to make that connection. Andrew first found his brother and not someone else's. Well, it's because he knew he had a connection with his brother. It very well might be easier to go find somebody else. We know that from our own family situations, don't we? Sometimes it's easier to go find someone else's brother. But it's also true that because Andrew knows his brother, that they have this similar desire to meet the Messiah. Hopefully, even though sometimes it's hard for us to bring a brother or sister to Christ, oftentimes the problem is that they knew us before we came to Christ. But hopefully they can see that Jesus has changed us. He's changed our purpose for living. And so all of us have loved ones who are not Christians, but many are content to believe they are. Many have tried to find a way to introduce your loved ones to Jesus. And it's hard. Jesus never said it was going to be light. He didn't say, Andrew, come follow me because this is going to be a piece of cake. Never did. It's uncomfortable. Yes, Jeff?
Who was the other disciple with Andrew? Do they know?
I read, and there's some, you can cross-reference it and piece it together. Can't say definitively, I think it was James, but I'm not sure of that. Andrew found his brother, and James would find his brother. Don't hold me to that.
No. Because they both spent the day with Jesus.
Yep.
But it just gives the account of Andrew going immediately.
Yep.
And I was just wondering if the other one had the same attitude, or if he didn't.
Or if it didn't happen till later.
Right.
Yeah. I think what's significant about this is Andrew went immediately. I mean, this is top priority. First, a matter of first importance to it. It's what we're given to do. And it's interesting then to consider his testimony. What was Andrew's story to tell? What did he have to tell? Pretty simple message, not an insignificant one, but what did he say? I have found the Christ. I suspect there was a lot more to the conversation in that. And yet most important is to testify with much excitement about that discovery. I mean, the sense of discovery. Reminds me of Dina watching Oak Island on TV. They're always digging in a pit trying to find some gold. Well, this is a lot more exciting than that.
It also shows that because they were disciples of John, they were looking for the Messiah.
Oh, yeah.
John on several occasions said, I'm not.
Yeah.
And so when they found him, they were excited.
You know, think how many, when they saw John, said, oh, that's him. And in long time after that, they're still doing it. Are you Elijah? Which one are you? And these two have finally narrowed it down. It's him.
Well, John told them, there he
It's
is.
him.
And they immediately took his word and said, okay, if that's him,
It's him.
follow him.
It's him.
And they did follow him right there instantly. And then Jesus turned around and said, what do you seek?
You know, we don't know what the meeting was like, but when these men met Jesus face to face, there was something supernaturally being revealed from Jesus. There was a divine communication there. He was revealing himself to them. But
It's strange too, they asked him, where do you abide? And he said, well, come, I'll show you.
yeah. I don't really, I just,
today with you. Wow.
yeah. It's interesting that question of where do they abide, and then further in Jesus' ministry, he's coming to people as he did to Zacchaeus and say, I must come to your house today. I don't have a house to live in except I'll come and dwell in yours. I'll come abide with you. And so they found him for whom they were seeking. How powerful is that testimony? I have found the Messiah. I've thought a lot about this lately, and I've alluded to it at other times. Would we not be better off when we're trying to teach someone, to make a connection with someone, to start with some kind of testimony of what we have found and what Jesus means to us? I think would be a much better conversation starter than asking, do you go to church? Or where do you go to church? What's wrong with those two questions? They put people on the defensive, don't they? They don't want to tell you they don't go, and they're not sure they want to tell you where they go, because just the question implies, I've got some judgment to make about that bunch. Wouldn't it be better to begin, this is who I found, and this is what he is to me? I mean, it's a very good conversation starter. It's also a way to test the heart of the one to whom you're speaking. I mean, if they've got any interest at all, your testimony is going to engender some kind of response. I mean, they'll either tell you, well, good for you, I don't care. Or they're going to tell you their testimony. Well, let me tell you my experience with him, and then there's a conversation starter. How is it for you? How is it for me? How did we come to this? And then you've got this relationship that if there's a difference in understanding, then you can approach it. I wonder if that's what's happened to our soul winning efforts in the generation since the 50s. That people aren't, while we have the truth, and yes, we are to teach the truth, wouldn't it be best to make the connection that this is what the truth has done in my life? I mean, I'm talking to myself as well. What's he mean? What's he mean to you? As Andrew's given his testimony, there's 4 things to consider about it. It was spoken. That doesn't sound like anything significant, but again, while we are to be living a life that's consistent with the gospel, I wonder if we're depending a bit too much on, well, we just want them to see Jesus in our example. It doesn't get us off the hook or let us slip past the responsibility to speak, to go and speak. Because really, just by Jesus' letting himself be found, he's given us the testimony, hasn't he? I mean, as we picture the Lord is pictured even in prophecy in the Old Testament, he's come as near to man as he could come. They've got to look for him, but he's letting himself be found. There's a story in that. And so, we already alluded to it, Then in Luke 8, verse 39, it talks about, return to your house and tell what great things he has done for you. Return to your house. The word tell means describe. Relate it to others, what he's done for you. Again, I wonder if perhaps this is why sometimes our teaching isn't more effective. What great things has he done for you? What confidence do you have? What hope do you have because of the great things he's done for you? In effect, when I look at people like Andrew, their teaching begins with the illustration, doesn't it? Their teaching begins with the illustration. I found him, and this is the great things he has done for me. Now, let's talk about him. Let's teach about him. Yes, sir.
We had the cure for cancer. If you had the cure for cancer, people would find out about it, and you would tell people about it. Now, what's being taught here is something far greater than cancer cure.
Yeah, a cure for cancer just extends this life a few more years.
This
Yeah.
is eternity. And yet more people would be excited about a cancer cure than they would be about teaching about a cure for not spending eternity in hell.
Hey, most all of us do it, don't we? We're ready and willing to speak on any subject that's dear to us. And you
This
can
should
tell.
be dear to us.
And you can tell what's dear to people, what's on their mind. I mean, I'm as guilty of it as anybody. I want us to look at Psalm 50 and verse 23. Psalm 50 and verse 23, considering this matter of giving a testimony. I'm going to start in verse 22 to show you the opposite picture, the negative picture. Now consider this, you who forget God, lest I tear you in pieces and there be no one to deliver. Whosoever offers the sacrifice of thanksgiving glorifies me, and to him who orders his way aright, I will show the salvation of God. To him who first offers the sacrifice of thanksgiving and sets his life aright, then this shall happen then, I will show the salvation of God. You see, our testimony is a sacrifice of thanksgiving. Implied there, a glad sacrifice which honors him. And the person making such a sacrifice, there in that situation, first has not forgotten God. He set his priorities in right order. And his highest priority is offering a sacrifice which honors God. By that which the man is assured, God will show his salvation. I think I alluded this to last Sunday in the lesson Sunday morning. Now, sometimes people want the salvation, but they don't want to turn their life to God. I want to believe you enough to receive my salvation, but I don't want to believe you to the extent that I'm going to obey you. Well, this is akin to that picture. Yes, sir.
Margin of note there for ordered, it says, prepare the way that I may show him.
By his ordering his own life, he is then preparing the way, putting himself in the condition that God can show him salvation. That's beautifully worded that way, because it shows man's cooperating with God.
Man's responsibility.
Read it one more time like that. That's really good.
Prepareth a way that I may show him.
Yeah.
Instead of order.
Yeah. That's a better than... he so values glorifying God that his response is to put himself in the place, in the condition that God can show him his salvation. And that's really what honors God. Both putting ourselves in that place, putting ourselves in that condition, and then all the more so by God showing his salvation.
That's what Andrew and them were doing with John. And when they heard this when they heard what John proclaimed, they just immediately followed Jesus. They just left John and followed Jesus.
Yep. And again, look at the effectiveness of a simple testimony. I mean, there's not a whole lot of book, chapter, and verse stuff there, because there wasn't book, chapter, and verse, but still, it's what these people had been expecting throughout their heritage. And suddenly, here he is. And as you said, Jeff, if you found it, you talk about it. And certainly they were. It's a very simple testimony. And it's said so simply that even a child could understand it. And I believe that's why it was effective. Because it was a natural response, wasn't a rehearsed thing. It just was so simple and naturally that God used it to bless others. And again, maybe I keep thinking about why I hadn't been more effective. And maybe that's it. Sometimes we're so anxious to get into the meat of it. But first you got to, as many have said, you got to have this point of contact with somebody. This is what I got, and I want you to find it as well. It's what's happening in Acts chapter 8 and verse 4. When those who were scattered were going out, they were preaching the word. The scattering was not the hindrance, was it? It was actually the benefit. It was the great boost. Man, if we're getting run out of town because this must really be something, Jeff. If they're not going to let me live there and talk about this, and I'm going to have to run and tell others, there's something to this. When you read there in Acts chapter 4, or Acts chapter 8, there in verse 4, the verse begins with a therefore. Acts chapter 8, let's look there. Those therefore who were scattered abroad. Well, there's a therefore. What was the before? Verse 1 through 3. And Saul was consenting to his death, and there arose on that day a great persecution against the church, which was in Jerusalem. And they were all scattered abroad throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. And devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul laid waste to the church, entering to every house and dragging men and women committed them to prison. That's the before, the therefore. And again, it wasn't a hindrance. It was a great benefit. Even in that, what would your testimony be? Well, our brother Stephen was murdered. But we've all been delivered. Powerful testimony, isn't it? The point is that we all have a story to tell. We all have a story to tell. It really appears that those who were scattered were energized by the persecution. They're not shut down, but energized by being delivered through the trials. Well, that's not typically how I work. I mean, some days when some things happen, I'm shut down. Frankly, I go to bed. That's not how it ought to be. Energized through it. And really the story is, since you found the Lord, your Savior, since you've been delivered, since He's answered your prayers, we have a story to tell. It was a certain testimony that Andrew was fully assured of. Even though he had just met Jesus, it was a sure testimony. You think about him, he is in a sense a rookie. He's just been drafted as a disciple. But he already has a story to tell. all around him, while there was all this uncertainty among the Jews, they're all seeking for the Messiah, but they don't know who it is. Or when one claims to be, they don't know which one he's claiming to be. There's all that uncertainty and all that disputing. But God has given sure and certain declarations in His Word in which we might find the same kind of absolute assurance. Again, in that day, I don't know what all was said between Jesus and these people when they met Him. But there's something divinely being communicated. He's revealing Himself to them. It's this confidence we see even in the life of Job. In Job 19, verse 25, here's his testimony. I know that my Redeemer lives and that I shall see Him. With all that's going on in his life, what's his testimony? Fully assured, really a simple testimony, isn't it? I know that my Redeemer lives and that I shall see Him. He's got a story to tell. We talk about, let me just run through a few of these. In John 9 and verse 25, there's the testimony of one who says, I was blind, I was, in other words, ignorant, but now I can see. They had a story to tell, didn't they? You think about those other people who were crippled, and Jesus just, in some cases, touched them. In some cases, He just looked at them. In some cases, He actually said something to them. And then He said to them, well, don't tell anybody now. What'd they do? They had to tell it. They had to tell it. The point is, when you know who you've seen, you'll say so. It's much like you said, Jeff, about the cure for cancer. When you know you've seen what'll work, you're going to say so. Look at Psalm 107 and verse 2. Psalm 107 and verse 2. That's my reference, but again, I'm going to back up to the first verse. Oh, give thanks to Jehovah, for He is good. His loving kindness endures forever. Let the redeemed of Jehovah say so. That's the point of all this. If you found that for which you're seeking, say so. When He has redeemed from the hand of the adversary, and gathered out of the lands from the east and from the west and from the north and from the south. Let the redeemed, those whom God has gathered to Himself, let them say so. There's not a suggestion either. What's it say? Let the redeemed. That's a command to say so. You've got a message to say, to tell. And God expects you to tell it. In that way, it is a sanctified testimony. I mean, when Andrew meets Jesus and Jesus calls him to follow, and doing that, Andrew knows he has been set aside for this purpose. And that's really the work of going and finding others. Again, it's partially because all the Jews were looking for a Savior. But in that way, that's the point of contact. They got that in common. Now, what's Paul talk about? To a Jew, I become a Jew. To a Gentile, I become a Gentile. There's this point of contact. If you know what they're seeking and you know you found it, well, then make the connection. It is why Jesus came to the Jews first. Because for thousands of years, they've been prepped for seeking a Messiah. I mean, if anyone should have believed, it was them. There's that point of contact. It does tell us that great wisdom or discernment is needed in this work of soul winning. And the assurance is that God will give it, just as he did to Andrew and to Peter and those others as they went to introduce others to Jesus. It's James who says in James 1 and 5, verse 5, if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask for it. I mean, that in the same way, let him ask for it. He's going to find it. If you're really desiring to find wisdom, you're going to find it. God's going to show it. We need to find out what people are seeking. What people are genuinely interested in, and make that the point of contact. That's interesting, even with Linda being back for the last 5 weeks. What's interesting, what worked in her. It took one person asking her or saying to her, I need to find a church. And it worked. There was that point of contact. And what a blessing that was for Linda. Has to be a great increase of her faith to see what happened. And I guess Tova's been here every week that Linda has been here. There's that bringing her to meet Jesus. As we've been considering in the introduction to the book of Luke, it's exactly what Luke's doing when he adapted the presentation of the gospel to that first audience being a high Roman official. There's a point of contact. You've got a doctor of some notable standing, you've got an officer of some notable standing, and they've got a similar mindset. There's the contact. And so it's respectfully written by a Gentile to a Gentile, and that's the contact. And the question is, when we look at these kind of examples, since we see that works, well, is that how we're doing it? Is that how we're doing it? Let's take a few minutes just to look at the third point. We considered his task. We considered his testimony. Look at the triumph in all of this. In John chapter 1, verse 42. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked upon him. That's where I believe Jesus is revealing himself to him. I mean, there's something in that connection. And said, you are Simon the son of John. You shall be called Cephas, which is by interpretation Peter. Peter, who often is so quick to have something to say, didn't respond, did he? In other words, it'll be just as you say, Jesus. That is what I will be called. But look at he brought him to Jesus. And then, yes, the rest of it's entirely between Jesus and Peter, how he responds to the Lord. But Andrew's work has succeeded, hasn't it? Was anything more required of him? Oh, not at that point, no. It's important to notice that Andrew's testimony was persuasive. Again, I think that's the power that we might be lacking in some of our teaching, is this persuasive argument. Peter must have seen something different in his brother Andrew. I mean, again, Jeff, if you really found that much sought after cure, there'd be something different about your demeanor, wouldn't there be? I mean, if you really, wow, this is it. Yeah. And particularly if it's this, there'd be something different about your demeanor. The fact is that I suspect it's true for everybody in this room. We were brought to the Lord, we were converted by someone else bringing us to that point. And that's really the purpose ever since the beginning. Look at Matthew 14. Matthew 14, verse 34. All these things spoke Jesus in parables to the multitude, and without a parable he spoke nothing to them, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken through the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things hidden from the foundation of the world. And then he left the multitudes and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the tares of the field. How does it work? And seemingly work best there. What did Jesus tell them? Let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story in a way that will cause you even to want to know more about it. What did they do every time after Jesus told them a story? Well, okay, now that's good, but explain it to us. What's this really mean? How does this really apply to our lives? That became the point of contact. Tell them a story, and genders a question, and then in the explanation they come to know Jesus. You see, you simply have to ask in this case, was it worth the effort?
Is that Luke 14, straight down?
Matthew, oh, did I read the wrong one?
Matthew 13?
Let me see. Were you asking if it was in Luke?
Well, I don't know.
Oh,
What you read.
I was reading Matthew. Oh, I'm sorry. I was in the wrong chapter. That's the problem with it. Yep, let me try it again. You can cut that out, Barry. Or leave it in. They'll say, oh, the old crazy old man can't read numbers. And when they had crossed over, they came to the land to Gennesaret. And when the men of that place knew him, they sent into all the surrounding region and brought to him all who were sick. And they beseeched him that they might only touch the border of his garment. As many as were touched were made whole. What's the point of contact there? You see, one of them has been healed. And everybody's hearing about it. Whoever it was is going about telling everybody about it and what happened. Here's the increase. Many are coming. Was it worth the effort? How do you think Andrew might have felt on the day of Pentecost? When Peter is up there proclaiming the gospel. Make you feel pretty good, wouldn't it? Peter, I'm the one that introduced him to Jesus. And he's proclaiming the good news to the world. It's a triumph in soul winning. You suspect, Jeff, there's some more Peters among us? I mean, not in the same way, but I mean, people who haven't yet met Jesus, and if they do, would become great leaders, great preachers. Just got to find that contact. Somebody's got to impress upon the person, I have found Jesus. Make that connection. I hope it's beneficial for us to consider these things. It's caused me to examine maybe the shortcomings when I've tried to teach someone else. You know, I have found, as was true in Jesus' cases when he talked to the woman at the well, all he had to show to her is that he really cared about her. And Jesus had only said two things to her, when then she takes the lead in the conversation, and she's asking him questions. And she's telling him what she needs to know. I have found once that's how it works best. I was all loaded, ready to lay it all out verse by verse. And the person let me know right up front, this is what I need to know. Okay, time's to shift gears here. This is the point of contact for this person. This is what they want to know. If I can show them that, then together we have somewhere to go. I believe it'll help us to not only be more successful in our teaching, but to bring more glory to God and more souls to Him. That does get us about through our hour. Our brother Glenn had our devotional for tonight, and he'll just have one laid by for the next time it's his turn. But I hope, again, it's beneficial for us to consider this. In all of those cases, as when Andrew brought Peter to Jesus and Jesus looked on him, there was something there that happened that would cause Peter to trust in Jesus. He didn't at that point know enough to even know how to believe on Jesus. But there's something in there that caused him to trust. It ought to be seen. And certainly we ought to trust in Jesus as well. I thought we'd close this evening and sing that song, number 679. 679. To consider, even in these examples we've considered as soul winners, the prophet John, how much did he have to trust, Jeff? Coming like a wild man out of the wilderness, people are going to say he's either drunk or stark raving mad. No, he's not. He's doing what he's sent to do. Same with Andrew. Doing what he's sent to do.